It's good to see all of you here for our Wednesday night Bible study. We're so glad that you can be a part of our group. And we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 14 tonight. So if you have your Bibles, we invite your attention to Matthew chapter 14. Jesus began a series of lessons in chapter 13 that are called parables. And there are several different parables mentioned in that chapter. What is a parable? Yes, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, let me ask you this before we begin tonight. Why did Jesus speak to people in parables? Okay, yeah, easy to understand. Definitely so. I heard a preacher one time, and it sort of stuck with me. He said, Jesus spoke in parables to reveal the truth, but also to conceal the truth. I thought, well, why in the world would Jesus want to conceal the truth? But look here in chapter 13. Let's just back up for a second. Chapter 13 in verse 13. Jesus said, "Therefore speak I to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, and neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, By hearing ye shall hear, and what? You shall not understand. And seeing ye shall see, and not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, should be converted, and I should heal them." So he gives an idea of the reasons why he spoke in parables. And first and foremost, to reveal the truth. For those who want to see it, but to conceal it from those who don't. Now, it's interesting to me, he said that this was fulfilled by what prophet? Isaiah. So there we have again. This seems like to me, like the 20th time, I don't know how many times, but it seems like a lot how he said this is the fulfillment of the prophet. So he is speaking in parables because also it is a fulfillment of prophecy. Now, I meant to look at this, and if you can find this before the end of class, maybe if you have a Bible app on your phone, I would really appreciate it. But it is actually a prophecy in the Old Testament specifically about Jesus teaching in parables, and it's mentioned, "I will utter dark sayings of old." Now, if you can find that passage and we can read that before class is over, I would love to do that. And in fact, I have my phone here. I could find that for you here in just a second. But at any rate, I want to begin in Matthew chapter 14, and let me see if I can find this passage real quick. Okay, Psalm 78 and verse 2. Psalm 78 and verse 2, it says, "I will open my mouth in a parable, and I will utter dark sayings of old." That is actually a prophecy about Jesus teaching in parables. So it is a fulfillment then, just like Matthew is teaching over and over and over about the fulfillment of prophecy. Okay, we're going to talk about some pretty good people tonight, some pretty good events that take place in Matthew chapter 14. All right, let's begin. Chapter 14 and verse 1. "At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus, and he said unto his servants, This is John the Baptist, he is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him." It's interesting that he called Jesus, John the Baptizer, come back from the dead. Now, what is the history of John the Baptist so far? What has happened to him? He's been beheaded. And he was in prison before that, was he not? The first time you read about him being in prison is earlier in the book of Matthew. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. I want us to go to Matthew chapter 11 and verse 11. And notice what Jesus says about John. Okay? Now, there are a lot of good people in the world, but there is no one greater, Jesus said, than John the Baptizer. Now I found this, and I outlined this, and I'm going to share with you something that I found in just a moment that's a little humorous. But here is sort of my outline of chapter 14. Okay, when I view it, I broke it down into sections, and I see 3 sections there. Number 1, I see a man who is fallen but not forgotten, talking about John the Baptist. He's been killed. Then I see Jesus, He fed the followers. He fed how many? I always thought that He fed 5,000. Is that what you thought? I always thought that, but in the text it said He fed 5,000, and then there were other women and children. So that's a lot. That's probably 7,000 people there. Is that a weather alert, by the way? What is that? An amber alert. Okay. I'm like, are we fixing to have a tornado or something? I need to get under a pew or what? All right. Then section number 3, somebody walks on water to go to Jesus. Who was that? Peter. And we'll read about that too in Matthew chapter 14. And I call that section Focus on Faith. Now, I found this. I always like to start out with something light, something humorous, but I thought this was funny. It says, single women, here's what they say: all good men are married. Married women say, I have a lousy husband. The conclusion is there's no such thing as a good man. Well, that's not true. Jesus said Himself about John the Baptist. Notice Matthew chapter 11 and verse 11. Will somebody read that for us?
Surely I say to you, among those born of women there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he.
Right. What if Jesus could say that about you? Man, I mean, that's a compliment. Jesus says about His second cousin, okay, Jesus is related to John, there's no one better in this world than John. So that's who we're talking about. You know, we come to chapter 14, a man who has been killed for preaching and teaching the truth. And it's kind of sad, really, what happened to him. Now, I sort of gave it away earlier. I was going to ask you what kin John the Baptizer was to Jesus. But you'll find this in Luke chapter 1. The angel of the Lord said to Mary, Behold, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. So Elizabeth was older than the age of bearing children. But the angel said that she would have a child and name him John. It's interesting that this angel said that to Mary, you're going to have a son too, and they will call his name Jesus. All right? So, how many months older is John the Baptizer than Jesus? I see them wheels are turning. Yeah, 6 months. That's right. I see them turning. See, he's 6 months in the conception process when the angel says to Mary, you're going to have a son too. She said, or the angel said, for with God nothing shall be impossible. And Mary said, Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word. And the angel departed from her. Well, then you read in verses 39 through 41 that Mary arose in those days, went to the hill country with haste, into the city of Judah, and entered into the house of Zacharias, and saluted Elizabeth. That's her cousin. Notice what happened. When it came to pass, when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, notice what John did. He leaped in her womb for joy. It's interesting. I always wonder if even as a baby in the womb, if God was saying something to John the Baptizer like, you are in the presence of holiness. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know why God chose to reveal this bit of information to us. But at any rate, John the Baptizer and Jesus are family. So, when you come to chapter 14, and you read there in verse 2, it said unto his servants, This John the Baptist, he is risen from the dead, and the mighty works do show forth themselves in him. Later, it is told to Jesus. Look at verse 12. The disciples came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. You know, they had to break the news to the Lord. They said, your cousin is dead. And in essence, he died because of you. You told him to go and teach and preach, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and now he's missing a head. I wonder how that made Jesus feel. I could imagine it was a lot like when he saw Lazarus dead. What did Jesus do when he saw his friend dead? He cried. You know, it always amazes me that when Jesus came to Lazarus' body and he knew he was going to bring him back from the dead, that he still cried. He was still upset by his friend's death, even though he knew that he was going to bring him back from the dead again. I do. Yes, ma'am. Sure enough. I agree with you 100%. You know, to me, death is the most terrible part about living. I mean, it literally kills the people who are living too when your loved ones die. So, all of us, I guess, have been missing a part of our souls when we lose people. And even Jesus experienced that. But just imagine, you know, the disciples come to Jesus, they say, well, they done killed John. You know, you said you would be with us, you would help us. You said all these things that would happen, but he's dead. So you can only imagine the fear then that the disciples have. They're thinking, well, do I need to keep doing this? Did not John ask the same question? In fact, just go back a little bit to Matthew chapter 11. Look at verse 2 and 3. John was in prison and he sent a message to Jesus. It says, when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to him, art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? We talked about this back in chapter 11. You know what John is doing? He's literally checking up on himself to see, is this really worth it? Because I want you to tell me, what he's saying to Jesus is, I want you to tell me if me being in prison is worth this or not. Because I've been here a little while, and I'm probably not going to make it out, is what I'm thinking he's saying. So are you really the Christ, or do we need to look for someone else? And Jesus told him, he said, yes, you tell John, the blind receive their sight. People are being healed. They have the gospel preached to them. So John had his words confirmed. He said, yes, okay. He's the Christ. And he lost his life for it. Okay, so we see a lot of important things happening here in chapter 14. Now, let me ask you this. What was the reason for John the Baptizer's death? If you could just put the nail right where it needs to be. Let's be specific. I'm sorry? A vicious woman. yeah. It's interesting. A woman named Herodias, whose wife was she originally? Philip. That was, that's Herod's brother, isn't it? Was it his brother? He took his own brother's wife to be his own. That shows you how good of a man he is. You know, it's not smart to do something like that. So you know this woman, whoever she is, she's got to be pretty evil if she's going to switch from brother to brother. You know what I mean? But notice what happens. Verse 3, Herod laid hold on John and bound him. This is in the past, but they're sort of telling the narrative now. This has already happened in the past. Okay? But he's telling it right now. He bound him, put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. And John said to him, it is not lawful for thee to have her. And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. So he wanted to kill him originally anyway, but he was scared to. Notice what happened. When Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them, and it pleased Herod. I'm guessing this would be his niece. That's kind of weird. Like, he is just, his mind is not right. Verse 7, whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she, being before instructed of her mother, said, give me here John the Baptist's head in a charger. And the king was very sorry, nevertheless, for the oath's sake. And them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her, and he sent and beheaded John in prison. Why do you think he was sorry? I'll give you a hint. It's something we already read. Do you think he was sorry because he thought, well, I really shouldn't kill anybody? In my opinion, no. I think he probably killed other people. It doesn't seem like he was too scared to murder. But he was scared to murder John. You remember earlier it says, for the people said that he was a prophet. So it's interesting what's going on here in chapter 14. He sees Jesus doing all these great things, and all these people are following Jesus, and he said, oh, man, I think John has come back from the dead. Now you can imagine what he's thinking. He's probably shaking in his boots a little bit. He's thinking, well, is this guy going to come back and haunt me or what? Verse 11, his head was brought in a charger given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother, and the disciples came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Now, I want to mention this. Why was it not lawful for him to have his brother's wife? Why would John tell him that? Do you think that Herod was a member of the church? The church is not in existence yet, is it? It's interesting that sometimes people get this idea that the laws of marriage only apply to people who are in the church. So you could live however you want to outside the church, but then once you become a Christian, that's when the laws of marriage apply. So you could be divorced like 5 or 6 times. You could live and party it up any way you want, but then, hey, when you become a Christian, you have all your sins forgiven, right? So all you got to do is just become a Christian, and then you get remarried. That is not a good doctrine to hold. You go a little bit later in the book of Matthew. Let's go to Matthew chapter 19 just for a moment, and then I will just notice something quickly here, and then we'll move on. But you'll notice that the church has not been established yet in Matthew chapter 19. It's interesting that Jesus uses an eternal principle to talk about the laws regarding marriage. So to say that a man could marry and remarry 5 or 6 times and then become a Christian and all that be wiped away, I'm just not seeing that. I don't want to be mean or rude, and I'll tell you this, I have great sorrow and sympathy in my heart for people who have been divorced. My parents were divorced. My father is remarried unscripturally right now. And I want to tell you, it destroyed my family. It was the worst thing that me and my brothers ever experienced in our childhood. So I want to tell you this. Number one, I do not look down on people who are divorced. I feel very, very sorry that they had to go through that because it is terrible. It's like a death in the family. So I think sometimes as members of the church, we have this tendency to sort of say, oh, they've been divorced. Well, yeah. That's because they're human, and real humans make some real bad mistakes. And people get divorced, even in the church. But I will say this, having said that, there are laws that God has put in place to keep people safe, to keep them from losing their souls. I forget what me and my son were talking about the other day. I think it had something to do with my foster child, but I can't remember. But I remember specifically making the comment that when you go outside of God's rules for marriage, things like that happen. And I don't remember exactly what the subject was. But the further we get away from God's laws, it's like you'll start creating things that shouldn't existed in the first place. You know, a child is supposed to have a mom and a dad. That's the way God designed it. And if the further the child gets away from God's plan of a mom and a dad, they're going to struggle more than a person who does have a mom and a dad. You know, I grew up as a teenager bouncing back and forth to my mom and my dad. And I can look back in my teenage years and I think to myself, you know what I was looking for a lot of the times when I was living like a hoodlum? I was looking for love. That's all I wanted. My mom was too drunk to love me. She was drunk all the time. Saturday morning when we got up, my mom would be cleaning the house with a 24-ounce Budweiser on Saturday morning. My dad got sick of her. He was tired of her doing it all the time, but he drank too. He just didn't drink like she did. I'm embarrassed to even tell you some of the stuff that my dad did in my house. I was looking for love because I wasn't getting it at home. The further you get away from God's plan, it goes wrong. So it's interesting when the religious people of the day, they said, if you are the Son of God, then when can a man put away his wife? It's interesting, Jesus' response here in the earlier part of Matthew chapter 19. He mentions the Old Testament scriptures. Notice here in verse 4. He answered and said to them, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. That's it for them. They're joined together for the rest of their lives till one of them dies. So then, verse 7, they try to come up with a scenario. They say, okay, well, have you read Deuteronomy 24? Because in Deuteronomy 24, according to our law, God allowed Moses to write a bill of divorcement. Notice, they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a writing of divorcement and put her away? You know what Jesus said to them? God never intended for you to put away your wives. Period. But because you were so wicked, and because you didn't want to do what God said, He had to regulate this thing by law. He had to put something in your law because of your wicked deeds just to control all the divorce that's taking place. Notice what He said. Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her which is put away, doth commit adultery. But you know, Herod the Tetrarch, he didn't want to hear that. He's thinking, man, I got this new wife, having a good old time. And John told me I can't have her. So he put him in prison, and John ultimately was killed because of it. You know, when I was reading this and studying for this, I thought of this principle right here. You know, Herod was, sad to say, he was a victim. You know, I never would have thought of Herod to be a victim because he was just pretty raunchy. But in this case, he was. He was a victim to what Miss Ramona said. An evil woman. Peer pressure. He got talked into murder. You know, the Bible says, do not be deceived. And I like this in the ESV. I go back and forth between the two, but in my opinion, it's so clear here in the ESV. Bad company ruins good morals. That's what happened to Herod. All right, any question or comment before we go on to the next section here? All right, this next section is a little bit short, and I want to get to the last section here in Matthew chapter 14. But we'll notice that Jesus fed 5,000 people. Now, to me, this is absolutely amazing. We're going to call this section number 2. He fed the followers. And you'll notice there were 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, when I was studying for this and I was reading this, there's something that stood out to me, and I want to see if you can find a point that I believe that Jesus is trying to make when he did this. All right, let's look at it. Verse 13. Jesus heard of it. He departed thence into a ship, into a desert place apart, and when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. Jesus went forth and saw a multitude, and he was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. The word compassion, I always like to notice this. It literally means to have your bowels turned. It's like that nervous feeling if you pull up on a wreck and maybe someone was thrown out of the car. How would you feel about that? You know, I hate to compare it to this, but you ever watch those sports bloopers shows on ESPN where you'll see like a kid skateboarding and he falls on his arm and then his elbow like pokes out this way? And you can't even look at it, you know, you're like, oh, that's terrible. You know? You get this weird feeling in your stomach. That's what Jesus saw when he looked at these people. He literally had his stomach turned for them. He had compassion on them. Okay, so let's notice what he did then. He healed their sick, and when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, "This is a desert place." Is that like sand and stuff, or what is that? It just means deserted. Okay? Now, whether there's sand and no water there, I don't know, but when you read that in the Bible, it usually just means there's nobody there. Okay? It's uninhabited. So it's a desert place, and the time is now past. He sent the multitude away that they may go into the villages and buy for themselves victuals. But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to depart. Give them to eat." And they said to him, "We have here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." How are you going to give 5,000 men, besides women and children, something to eat with this? It's amazing. He commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass. He took 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude, and they did all eat and were filled. That is outstanding. They took the fragments that remained up 12 baskets. Everybody was full, and they're thinking, "Oh, I can't eat another bite." You know? And he said, "Well, we need a basket to take some of this home. In fact, we're going to need 12 of them." They were filled, remained 12 baskets full, and they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, let me ask you this. What are some things that you think Jesus is trying to show them by feeding them? There's a couple of things that stood out to me, and I'll share them with you in just a minute. But what do you think? Okay. Definitely so. In fact, anytime I would see a miracle performed by Jesus, to me that would be the number one thing that he is trying to show to that audience. And I think that's a real good answer. There's some smaller lessons to me that sort of stand out too. And what did Jesus call himself? He said, "I am the what of life?" I'm the bread of life. Okay, yeah. That's sort of the stuff that I'm trying to get to. So Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And what did he give them? He gave them bread. I also believe what you said. Things can go a long way when Jesus gets involved. That's what Miss Carol told us. That's another great lesson. If you stay with me, you will learn some really outstanding things from me. I will take care of you. I will provide everything you need. These are lessons that I believe he's trying to show them. Well, at any rate, in John chapter 6 and verse 35, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life, and he that cometh to me shall never hunger. He that believeth on me shall never thirst. I think that's one lesson that he's trying to show them. You were fed this bread from heaven as your fathers wandered around the wilderness. And he talked to them in John chapter 6 about that. And he said, but I will give you the bread of life. Okay? Earlier, John chapter 6, Jesus answered them and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me not because you saw the miracles, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. You see, they just want to follow Jesus around because, hey, they're going to eat some good food. He said, you're not following me because I'm the Son of God. You're just trying to gain the benefit. He said, labor not for the meat that perishes, but for that meat which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. For him hath God the Father sealed. So I think these are all good lessons. Another lesson, you may remember that Jesus quoted this to the devil in Matthew chapter 4. When the devil said, if you are the Son of God, then command that these stones be made bread. Jesus said, man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. So that, to me, that's another lesson. You know, he said, look, you stay with me, I'll provide your needs. If you stay with me, things will always go further than you expect. If you stay with me, you're going to learn that spiritual things are more important than 5 loaves and 2 fish. Well, I know that's a sort of a short lesson, a short idea there, but I wanted to get to this last part. We've got about 5 minutes left. And we'll notice the last section about when Peter walks on the water. Now, if it were me, I don't know if I would have done that. You know, I try to picture myself, and I hope that I would get out of the boat. But, you know, there were other disciples in that boat, and they were not about to get out. Now, why do you think that those other disciples were not going to get out of that boat? What are your thoughts? Yeah.
Until he got started.
That's true.
The others seemed to be more afraid at the front.
Yeah. You know, I think Peter, he wasn't a thinker a lot of times. He didn't think till later. And I guess most of us could probably relate to that in some way. But, you know, I think about what's going on, and there's a storm. You know, when we think about Jesus walking on the water, we normally think like it's a glass, smooth type, you know, and he just peacefully comes out there strolling, says, hey guys, y'all look like y'all having a good time. No, there is a bad storm. You know, Jesus told them, you go out there, go to the other side or whatever, and all of a sudden this storm comes in the 4th watch of the night. Now, I did some studying on that today, and I thought, what is the 4th watch? Well, there's 12 hours in a night. The 4th watch is the last section of that night. Okay? They begin at 6 p.m. 6 to 9, watch 1. 9 to 12, watch 2. 12 to 3, watch 3. 3 to 6. So you're talking 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. That's the 4th watch of the night. So this is very early in the morning. They've been out there all night. Now, it's interesting to me, you look at verse 22, straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship to go before him to the other side while he sent the multitude away. He sent the multitudes away. He went up in a mountain. What was he doing? He was praying. So probably, I'm just guessing, from the first hour of the night until 3 a.m., the Son of God is praying. I mean, I don't know any other way to look at that. He went up in that mountain and he was praying all that time. And at 3 a.m., when he comes down from that mountain, he came down for one reason. The storm came. In my opinion, he would have been there all night. He would have been there till the sun came up praying. But he noticed a storm came and he remembered his disciples are still out on that water. And he came and got them. To me, it's amazing that they were afraid when they saw him come out. Now, I wanted to make several points here. I may not have time to do it. But notice as he continues, verse 24, the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. They were afraid. They cried out for fear. Verse 27, Jesus spake to them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. Anytime there is a storm, I believe Jesus still comes. I don't believe he's going to come like he did there. I remember in Acts chapter 7, there was a man stoned. What was his name? Stephen. It's always interesting to me, and I don't know if this is significant or not. I think it is, that when Stephen looked up into heaven as he was dying, it says he saw the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the throne of God. As far as I know, in every other place in the Bible, when Jesus is depicted, what is he doing next to that throne? He's sitting down. For some reason, I believe the Holy Spirit chose to reveal that to me and to you. He was looking down and seeing the storm that Stephen was enduring. The reason why Matthew is writing about this storm and that Jesus came to them walking on the water, in my view, is because he's telling us today that Jesus still comes. He still wants to help. Now, he's not going to miraculously come and take care of our storm, because sometimes he doesn't calm the storm. Sometimes he calms us. There was another time when there was a storm and he said, Peace be still. But he took Peter in the midst of the storm and he said, Peter, you come out of that boat. And Peter went. All right, we'll pick up on that next time. Thank you.